Hello, everyone. You guys are ready? So today we are very lucky to have Eli to be our guest speakers. So Eli is the product lead for the Documented and a local newsroom serving immigrants in New York City, and former R&D and advertising editorial liaison director at the Washington Post. So today she is going to share her lecture on the topic of rethinking revenue, audience, and editorial strategies for local communities. So the stage is yours, Elite, and you'll be able to see my students here too, and I can come here too. You can see me here. Yeah.
Sounds good. Hi,
Okay.
everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me into class today. This is this is a really broad topic that we're talking about, revenue, audience, and editorial strategies in professor's class. I'm sure it's been a busy semester, whether you're on the journalism track or you're in comms or anything adjacent to that. This is rapidly evolving. I became a journalist. I started my journalism career in 2013, and it feels like every single year we have had unprecedented things happen that really change the system that we're in. So I want to share with all of you some things that I've learned along the way, um, and be able to share some different things to think about. One thing I want to really stress is that standardization of many things in journalism doesn't quite exist. That's a reason why we don't have licensing and things like that that standardizes how people do best practices revenue or best practices in membership or reaching your audience. You don't even really need to have a degree in journalism to work as a journalist or a fundraiser or audience manager. That means our field has a lot of latitude and we do a lot of creative problem solving. But that also means that we need to establish our own best practices for our own organizations and professional experiences. That means talking to a lot of people, not being as competitive and secretive as I think we used to do and we had the luxury to be able to do, but really staying connected to your peers who are on the same track as you. Um, Reaching out to people like guest lecturers, like your professors, like me. You can always email me with questions along the way. I'm always happy to talk to students and early career journalists there. So I'll split this I'll split this lecture up, and lecture is a strong word for what I'm about to take you through. I'll split this up into basically showing you a lot of different examples of both audience strategy. What does that look like in terms of experimenting? What can you rely on? What can you control? What is completely out of your control in terms of reaching your audience? The second part here will be around revenue strategy, how we might think about diversifying revenue strategy depending on the newsroom organization that you're in, and have really trying to have people who know as much as possible what they're doing and how to learn more of those things, because that's a real problem sometimes as well with folks who are not familiar with that and take that on. All right, so I will go ahead and share my screen, and I'll just ask for y'all to confirm that you can see that. Uno momento. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, excellent. I'll go ahead and start out with several use cases on audience strategy and different ways that different organizations do it. As Professor mentioned, my background is mostly in really large national newsrooms. I worked at the Washington Post for several years. I worked at Vox Media, which had like at the time 9 different news, like we would call them networks. So like Vox.com was one, SB Nation was another, but they all had a centralized product team. And I've worked outside of a newsroom as well, which is trying to support local newsrooms and being able to be more sustainable and reach their audiences in more genuine ways. So right now, I lead product at a wonderful small newsroom that has 20 people total on staff and many other contractors. We are a nonprofit. It's called Documented, based in New York City. We publish news in 4 different languages for immigrants themselves and immigration professionals. So it's Spanish, Simplified Chinese, Haitian Creole, and English. It's probably the most unique newsroom that I've ever worked in, and really, really, I feel very much like every single day, we're making a lot of impact, which is not the same as I've felt in other situations as well, which you will probably experience in your careers as well. So, talking through a little bit of how it's so different in this newsroom and some things to sort of look for if you're really interested in audience strategy. Um, Saying that we serve immigrants is really different than actually being able to serve them, or when you're talking about underrepresented audiences, people who are not in the who are marginalized groups who may not be the most affluent people who are the default who mainstream newsrooms may reach very easily. Um, you kind of have to take different tactics to be able to make sure that you're reaching the right people who you mean to serve. So if we spend all this time trying to publish in Spanish and simplified Chinese and Haitian Creole, how do we actually reach people who primarily speak those languages? So I'll walk you through, a couple of years of what we were trying to do to directly reach these audiences, which includes developing a custom audience strategy here. A couple of ways. One was really fun on the product side is being able to build tools like this wage theft monitor. This in particular is an interactive database where many small businesses just tracking all of these areas that do primarily hire and work with the immigration workforce and tracking those who are guilty of wage theft, right? That not so withholding payment or being able to hold that over their employees' heads, tracking all of those things because they are available in databases. And so this particular database is meant for people who are researchers, but also people who are affected primarily and want to know, is my workplace on this list, for instance? What can I do about it? That was one project that we worked on. That was a different audience than the ones that we primarily tried to reach. That included academic researchers who are also researching immigration in particular. Very interesting. Many different stories here that are related, as in 127,000 New Yorkers. Those workers have been victims of wage theft. So that was an indicator for us that this is more than a story that we report. It's an ongoing database in which we can use that information as we update it to report on accountability stories for the immigrants that we serve for in particular. So that's one. I wanted to hop over to a couple of other newsrooms. So VT Digger is based in Vermont, Chicago Reader, Chicago, Honolulu Civil Beat, Honolulu. I want to point this out and kind of hear your thoughts on this particular story, which is from Nieman Lab. Nieman Lab is a great publication hosted at Harvard that kind of looks at what the industry of journalism looks like. So these three newsrooms, these three local newsrooms, saw really huge traffic gains in the past like several 6 months. Um, I don't know if you've been talking about this in class, but in that same time span, especially when you search, you might look for different things. You might see these AI previews that basically you don't have to click into links very much anymore because it kind of returns what you're looking for right at the top. Has anyone seen that so far? Yeah? Does that look familiar to you? Okay, so that has become a real problem over the years. Like when I started in 2014, Google started doing this and it became a really big problem for anyone working election night and covering local politics or national politics because it's important for us to be able to say like, hey, read the story about or come to our website. We're tracking like we're calling election results, things like that. We're kind of putting our neck on the line. This you have our integrity, you have like the ethics that we comply to, but you could also get information from anywhere on the internet that is embedded about the same uh, election result. And we're jockeying for the same place in Google search for people who are looking for what's happening in that election. So this is really interesting because I think in particular, we have been seeing such a huge crater in traffic across many different newsrooms in general because of the AI previews where people don't click into the story. However, we've seen the opposite, which is very unpredictable, which is sometimes these platforms, Google, Apple News, MSN, Bing, even, they have these sort of like, sometimes they want to draw people into content and they don't want you to just be on search. Their goal, those platforms, is to get you to use the platform more and to be more engaged. So sometimes they will have like this PR like push where they might curate a lot of stories and try to have you spend more time on their version of that site, right? So Google's latest version of this is Google Discover. And for especially for Android users, this shows up quite a bit. So that's a team of people who we don't know very much about. Sometimes they're journalists, sometimes they're not, who get to pick stories and be able to see, like, okay, this is what people will see if they are an Android user. They see Google Discover. It's a lot more likely to be clicked. Apple News has its own version as well. And it kind of it leads to these unpredictable amounts of traffic, which these three newsrooms have experienced in the past 6 months. Do you think you can depend on this kind of thing? Like, hey, like I'm betting that we're going to make this much revenue per quarter. This is how much we should spend on our search team, things like that. How reliable do you think that might be? Any thoughts?
Hello, Elit. I'm sorry, like I think anyone wants to answer the question, I have to bring the microphone to you. But remember, you guys need to take notes because the quick response question will be related to the guest speakers. You have to know what the guest speakers have, what you have learned from this lecture. Okay, sorry, Eli. It's just
It's
like
okay.
I have to
Don't worry.
bring the microphone to you. Anyone wants to answer the question or your thoughts?
It's okay. It's also early in the morning. You're just getting warmed up, so no problem.
Okay.
So for this, you can't count on it. Google sometimes they will act in their own interests, right? They will optimize their own algorithm. They may push AI previews that take a lot of content from your website and your stories that your reporters work really hard to do, and then just show it in search without having any revenue to your platform. Or they could sometimes curate one of your stories and you get like several hundreds of thousands of views on one or two stories, but that's it seems random, right? So this is something that I think if you are in an audience development position, this is not something that you can count on. In the last several years working in newsrooms, we've decided to optimize for search like SEO, but there's not a lot you can control here. But there are things that you can control by being able to really invest and understand your audience in ways that traditional newsrooms have not always taught you how to do. A lot of it is feels very entrepreneurial at this point. All right. So I want to highlight another local news case study here, which is based in South Carolina in Charleston, one of their biggest cities over there. And there was a really innovative editor-in-chief who I believe works at, he might lead the Chicago Sun-Times or something like that now, Mitch Pugh. So this is back in 2019. So imagine that you are running a newsroom. Traffic is in decline. You're sort of trying to figure out how to engage your audience in particular and make sure that in this really polarized time, people are informed, they know what's going on around them. And also, your content can be fun. It's not only doom and gloom, like crime stuff going on or whatever local events are going on, right? It's like, what are different ways that we can reach, engage people, and get them more curious and active in the community around them? Newsrooms should be part of the community around them. People should know a journalist in general and be able to reach out to them if they need help or accountability. So the experiment this publisher did at the Post and Courier in Charleston in 2019 was when he came on board because he wasn't there before, like as an editor, he decided he looked at his group of editors. So someone who did politics, someone who did sports, someone who did food, someone who did wellness. So all these people were in charge of their own teams. They, someone who did audience, they all did different things, but they should have be moving in the same direction, right? Instead of competing against each other, because there's not that much space to compete against each other in the same newsroom, but you will see it sometimes. So what he did was he assigned them all sort of the same thing, right? Where his thought was really each of you is going to be a general manager of your own section. That means that you're an editor. Sure, that's the job that you know how to do, which is produce content, edit stories, assign them to reporters, check the traffic as you go along, optimize for social. That's your job by default. But in this landscape, we really need to figure out how to evolve each of those content areas. How will sports exist in 5 years? What's the revenue strategy on that? It can't just be someone else's job because when you hand that over to someone else to do, they may not have the same understanding and background and misrepresent it for advertisers or subscribers or something like that. So how can you get more involved in that as the owner of the actual content? lot of interesting things came from that. Um, when each of these editors became a general manager meaning you're responsible for the whole business under that part of your topic, for instance. So as a food editor, we saw a lot of interesting ideas come out from that. So being able to host events and partnering with people and being out in the community. There were trivia nights at like local bars that were hosted on current events, trying to figure out ticketed events as well that people want to have access to, being able to showcase some of the new chefs that they were talking about from new restaurants in Charleston. A lot of local pride as well that came from this. They were able to get local celebrities from sports teams to be able to come and meet their readers and exclusive events from the sports team. um, this was, I just love this use case because it's so creative. It doesn't have to be what you might run into as like very serious journalism in terms of like you already in charge of so many things. How can you make it more fun and more accessible for people to want to know what's going on around them and get involved? Civic participation is a huge part of that as well. So thinking about this concept of mini publishers and making sure that it's not just one person's problem to solve or one person's responsibility to solve for what does our newsroom look like in 5 years, 10 years? How do we get more audience? How do we become more vital to the community around us? Why should people read our content at all or come to one of our events? It's not someone else's job. You can certainly have those ideas as well and be more empowered to do that. And I think this experiment really, really does show that that is possible. All right. So, any questions so far before I keep going on in audience strategy use cases?
Any questions so far? Anyone have questions? Could raise your hand. I will get the microphone to you. For
Okay,
now,
no
it's
problem.
not daylight. Yeah.
No problem. All right, so cool. So I'll keep showing you different ways to think about audience strategy and evolving that for your newsroom, even your student newspaper now. When I was working with the student newspaper and then as an adjunct at University of Maryland, I saw a huge problem in we're not actually reaching our fellow students. How is that possible? We are here to serve them. There's something missing, right? There's some connection of like it's important to read these things, not because you have to, but because it's useful to you. So how is that usefulness come in and rethinking what that looks like rather than we have to do these kinds of stories, our professors or our faculty want us to. That doesn't really work as well as it used to because you have so many options, right, of being informed. Okay, so this particular use case comes from nearby Chicago, where I'm from as well. So City Bureau is a really great newsroom to follow to kind of see how they are innovating in terms of reaching their own community. A huge thing of what City Bureau does is so they're based on the south side of Chicago, which is historically marginalized, more people of color, lower socioeconomic groups in general has been redlined. And you can see the stark difference just riding on the same train from north side to south side. So they wanted to set up shop in south side, but they had the problem of like, how do we get people engaged in this community that we're trying to reach and make sure that we're not just informing people on the north side about what's happening in the south side, like an anthropologist would. We are journalists, we are part of the community. How can we might be able to do this? And a lot of the things that they do is they don't do breaking news every single day. They do more like civic participation and what is going on, what should you know in local politics, what should you know is being addressed in your neighborhood. One example might be a data center was proposed to open in the South Side and would draw from Lake Michigan, for instance, and that would have severe effects down line, right, of electricity bills being more costly for people in that area, potentially health effects for people who live near it. So you might have seen those stories around the country as well. So that was happening around here. And they were able to shut it actually down a couple of months ago. So that's an example of civic participation here. But bringing this back on, all to say, so City Bureau, they do a lot of local meetings, city meetings. You might have already reported on some of these meetings, and you're kind of like, wow, there's no one from the community here, right? Like that's at least what I saw as a reporter of just like, oh, how do we bridge that gap between like local government and all these decisions being made that we should know about and like what the consequences are and people actually participating and finding ways to like understand what that means for their lives. So Max Resnick is a really great person who leads up City Bureau's Documenters Network. So that means that they had a real problem with getting people engaged and interested in what was going on in local city meetings. Tons of them were going on that had lots of implications for people's lives. What they did was they fundraised around a particular initiative, and the Documenters Network is really around how do you get people who live in the community that you serve to help you actually report news. You might not have as many people on staff as or freelance as you want or might need to be able to cover a topic really extensively. So they thought about if we fundraised for a certain amount, like and each person gets like $200 to go to a meeting, and then they learn how to pay attention to those meetings and how they translate things back, we can learn a lot about how an average citizen in this neighborhood, like an average community member, would translate the same stuff that we as a reporter would take and be able to write that out to share with their community members. They would do that in 100 different ways, right? It's not just the way that a reporter would, that they would be trained, that sometimes fails to get to the audience anyway. There's a lot to learn from that. And they've been able to do that the last couple of years as well. And was able to actually fundraise quite a lot on top of that, because if you hire 100 people over a couple of years to go to these city meetings and cover things differently, and be able to share them in their own networks of people who live in the community, you learn a lot of different things, but also you spread the word in a really natural way in the community of like, hey, I want you to read my story. You're my neighbor. I'm a community leader. It's just breaking the model of like being a separate journalist from your community. And I think that's a really interesting thing to pay attention to in particular. All right. I think I have one or two other things in audience here. Um, the other thing is you may not have to blend your community members doing the actual reporting and journalism, but it is really important to listen to them. So in really meaningful ways, because it's a matter of being able to spend hours and perhaps days and weeks on stories that evolve over time, or spending that same amount of time and investing that in having someone continue to do those same kinds of stories. But if no one reads them or very few people read them, you need to figure out the problem there of like, why is this not relevant or useful to the people I'm trying to serve? How can I solve that problem? This was an experiment that at my previous workplace, which is American Press Institute, it's a journalism support organization that helps local newsrooms better connect to their audiences and also raise revenue from that as well. I was the vice president of product strategy there. One of my colleagues who now works at Temple University in the journalism school, he had this experiment where in a particular city, so this one is Pittsburgh, he got 5 Pittsburgh newsrooms together to in this cohort program where they assembled local community leaders who represent different parts of Pittsburgh and the audiences that these newsrooms are supposed to reach. Um, each one of these newsrooms was struggling with traffic, right? Like that meant that people didn't read their stories. Maybe it's a problem of like being able to find them, but more often it's a problem of, okay, your content is not useful and sometimes actually offensive for your local communities. Like if you ever see something like that, that might be familiar to you of like, why did you write it that way or something like that, right? So they were all very scared to be accountable, by the way. Like this is very vulnerable work, but it's something that either your newsroom is just going to keep declining, and it's not just because of search and all those different things, it's because it's not useful or not relevant in the same ways to your community who can keep you alive and around if you are useful to them, um, then just sort of fading out and blaming Google and whatever else necessarily for that. What they did is they set up a local news advisory committee for these 5 Pittsburgh newsrooms, and these people represented all different parts of the community. Some of them were really angry. They were just like, you need to, we have problems with how you all cover crime. We have problems of who you mostly write for. We never see stuff in our community here unless it's crime. Just like these things are patterns in society in general, and we have to be so careful as arbiters of fact and truth and being able to try to be informed, like try to keep our audiences informed, and be very responsible about not passing on those biases in our coverage. Otherwise, it's not useful for anyone who we're trying to reach. So they met over the period about 6 months. They had a lot of like sort of useful tips here, and I'm happy to send on all these links as well. Um, and trying to set up feedback loops in which they were able to continue to give information and feedback, and actually work through some of the issues by experimenting with people in the community of like, so how might we be able to embark on this particular project or the story reporting? What other sources do you think, like who else should we talk to who we haven't talked to before because they're not easy to reach or we haven't established that trust, and that's why it's not easy for us to reach out to them. So something to look into there of like, what does it look like to have go-to people who in your community are maybe willing to give you a second chance if your organization has not established that trust in the past and simply just broadcast out stories that you think that are useful, but maybe they're not anymore. The last audience thing that I'll send you is, okay, so our Spanish speaking vertical was first. Those were the first immigrants that we served in New York City. There are about 700,000 immigrants in New York City who speak Spanish primarily. But the other two that we established afterwards are not as large. They're not as like close knit, like identifiably close knit necessarily. And they're sort of very geographically distributed across the 5 boroughs, right? So we have a couple of challenges there. What my boss, before I joined Documented, what he set up about 5 years ago was a regular research loop to make sure that the communities that we're trying to serve, we understand um, how they feel as a community. Like for instance, the Caribbean diaspora in New York City is very different than the Chinese immigrant diaspora. Like it's over like 100 years. There's huge waves of Jamaicans and then Haitians recently necessary. So I'm generalizing here, but it's different. And then there's like the Chinese community is has immigrated in different waves and has a little bit more of a geographical um, like commonality, like where they're based. So we can kind of pick languages and different ways to reach them, but it doesn't work unless we're in those communities as well with reporters who can speak those languages and write in those languages in different ways. In the past, in large newsrooms, what we would do is like, oh, great, like our foreign correspondent based in Southeast Asia, who is not Southeast Asian, would send the story back to us and be like, send it to Chinese people in the US or something like that. But we had no like trust built with that community, necessarily. How would we possibly be able to get on WeChat and be able to send this to people who actually spoke Mandarin or simplified Chinese? You need to be able to connect that to the audience. You can't just translate it and then just blast it off and hope people will find it. It just doesn't work that way, right? It's not how we get information or anyone gets information necessarily. So we do this every couple of years. We talk to people from each community. We ask them about their feelings, about how they understand what's going on in the world. We ask what platforms that they're on. We learned a lot about, for instance, for our Chinese community and why we set up and hired who we did to be the reporter there is that WeChat was very important here. It's followed by newspapers or websites. Most people feel like they have to also follow along with English newspapers and websites for Chinese immigrants and communities in New York alongside the Chinese sources there. So they kind of understand like who the local elected leaders are. We were able to define what ages of people we were able to target, whether that would be international students versus people who are like between 30 and 60 who might normally check out news sources anyway. And then we can kind of drill down by there by being able to bother to spend the time to get to know our communities, to ask them questions, to be able to validate some of the biases and assumptions that we came in with. Um, this is exceedingly rare and it should not be, I think. In my whatever it was, like 12, 13 years of product work, sometimes I got like 1 week to try to do this on my own because no one else deemed it was important. But this is kind of revolutionary and it keeps winning awards because we bother to do this kind of work to get to know our audiences that are not well reached by newsrooms like us, for instance. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about AI and then go into revenue. Any questions? Anyone want me to back up and talk about something else a little bit more?
Any questions now? Maybe we'll ask question like after you talk.
Why
You
don't we do
like,
that
yeah.
after? That sounds good. Okay, cool. All right. So AI is okay, when we're talking about AI, we're talking about generative AI, at least in this presentation, meaning working with ChatGPT or any of the machine learning models in the background to be able to surface like recommendations and personalized profiles for people who we know like to read stories of that certain topic, for instance. Trying to optimize mostly for like how can we make some parts of our news grabbing a little bit faster or be able to help us with planning or outlines or revenue or anything in the back end. So, a couple of use cases here, especially as you head into your internships and you might be playing with AI in your own, you might be using ChatGPT or anything like that, is trying to understand what's appropriate and what's actually a good creative use case to be able to use it to accelerate things that you may not have to do manually. So the Minnesota Star Tribune, which is a wonderful newsroom, it's not terribly far from you guys in terms of thinking about internships in the future. Very innovative, a great product team, pretty rare, I would say. Especially, I come from the Midwest as well. If I was a student, I would try to get an internship there as well. They know pretty much everyone. But you all have heard about in the last several months the massacre that happened there and trying to of the elected officials, unfortunately. And when they were trying to report on the shooters like background of like the folks who were responsible, there's a lot of confusing stuff that they found, for instance, like some languages that they couldn't really grok, like what language is this? Is this relevant to the shooter's background? What else can we find about them in particular? How could we start to tell the story a little bit more of what happened to these elected officials and who this gun person was? And so, following through this use case in this case study in particular, there was a couple of news innovation engineers and also reporters working with them, trying to process all the comments that were going on and seeing if any of them was relevant to be able to tell the story and like what leads looked like. So, using AI to try to translate words on the page to identify what languages were. Some of them were Cyrillic and Russian, and some of these like it's hard and traumatic to be able to pour over that yourself, right? Like especially when you're covering really, really tough traumatic things that have happened to a community, you don't want to have your reporters like go over and try to forensically interpret things. You want to try to let AI to take over some things like that, that of course you will fact check, but you don't need to expose so many people to like really disturbing content. In general, this is something I worked on in 2020 as well. The Minneapolis killings, it was just a lot of stuff that I didn't want my reporters to have to work on when we had to see hundreds of social media videos going on of what was happening in those protests. We just wanted to try to figure out, is this a job for AI to be able to scan through and to geolocate things for us rather than having to identify exactly where it was and fact check it through videos by watching it ourselves. So they were able to glean a lot of different things from using AI to sort of speed up and validate things that are hard to fact check, that are full of mistakes. Like if you tried to map like Cyrillic Russian with someone who doesn't know at all what this language could be and trying to measure that up, it just takes so much longer. And kind of going from there to be able to be like, is this something on the internet that this maps to that could give me a new lead and being able to provide more background on what happened here and perhaps what happens next. Um, all right. So a couple of other things on AI, I would encourage you to read this afterwards. I don't want you to have to necessarily be quizzed on all these different things, but I'll just kind of hop through and show you a couple different use cases of different challenges that AI may be able to help you think about differently. So, for instance, in a local newsroom that may be owned by a larger company or like might be a chain, if there are many different bureaus or like different towns that you are in charge of covering, what might you be able to automate a little bit to at least give you leads and sources and different things that are happening in many of those towns? So this is something that many different news companies are doing now. Gannett is really leaned into it. CT Mirror, I think, is a really interesting example of this that is worth looking into a little bit more later. But that's generally those are my audience strategy use cases. I want to make sure that we move into some revenue strategy as well. I think this is very much there's like this really damaging stereotype, I think, in journalism where, okay, at least I heard this. I hope this is not burdened on you and your generation, which is essentially like, I'm not in charge of finances. I don't have a background in math. Like, I can't really drive a subscription strategy. Like, what I was trained in is journalism. That's no longer like the case anymore. Like being very literate in terms of like running a business is very vital because they're in small newsrooms. Sometimes it is the same person who is in charge of the editorial strategy and also to make sure that this business survives and it's useful to the community around them. All those things can be creative. All those things can be interesting and really, really benefit from having people from experiences on both sides be able to make the business better and to be able to be more useful to your audience. And it really skews badly if only one person is in charge of the whole business that only has one of those backgrounds. You can gain this experience on the job as well. You don't need to get a separate degree in order to do these things, but it is a responsibility to keep on learning if you don't have a background that way. A really fun site in New York that is one of the sites that I check quite often. I don't live in New York anymore, but I lived there for about I think 3 or 4 years, and I would have loved to have this sort of local site. It's called Hellgate. It's sort of like a snarkier view. It's sort of like The Onion a tiny bit, but it's not completely fake. It's like a little bit of an angle and perspective on different things going on in New York City. And it's interesting that they found this voice that is still journalism, but it's opinionated, right? And they were able to find a real foothold in a very crowded market full of news outlets in a really densely populated city. That was crazy to me to see how successful that they could be. They started out as a newsletter that people quickly cottoned onto. They saw a gigantic increase in subscribers. They've now been around, I think, yeah, going on 4 years, and that they're thriving in this way and finding more people and like being able to hire more people because that they were able to tie their editorial strategy so much to being able to convert people. There was this like very, I don't know if you saw the story necessarily, but we're covering the New York mayoral election, which has gotten global attention from one of the candidates, who's Zoran Mamdani. One of his, the former mayor, Eric Adams, one of his policy advisors was caught trying to bribe a journalist by passing like a red envelope full of like $100 bills to a journalist to try to get like good coverage. And obviously that didn't work, but it got covered in such a way that Hellgate, when they were able to write about it, they wrote the same story as us. They wrote the same story as many other people, but then they had a really snarky like conversion of like, subscribe to support us, like pass that chip bag our way or something like that. And it was just like, it really worked for them. It was very much them. And it ended up driving a lot more subscribers and conversions in their voice in a way that no one else was able to really capitalize on. And that's just like, okay, that actually did work. You can have some personality. You don't have to be completely dry and formal. And you can, have that voice in a way people will respond. Um, Going back to Pittsburgh here, Public Source is, I think, another local newsroom really worth being able to look at and to pay attention to. They experiment quite a lot with different ways to be able to reach out to and be useful to their communities. I thought this was a really thoughtful reminder. They were in this lab cohort from the local media association. And just like being able to cover like, hey, the expectations here is you can't turn around a revenue strategy in like a year or 2 years. It takes a really long time. As long as your newsroom um, has been around, you need to invest that amount of time to figure out what a sustainable way to make money is. Just like you had to figure out a sustainable way to be able to produce stories and content, and especially in a way that's useful to people. I just thought that was a really good reminder there from someone who is actually really successful in this field and is willing to change. And then they were also part of the cohort that was bothering to listen to their community and have a local news advisory in that way as well. Okay, a couple more, and then I will leave it open for questions. Election night, this is something that sometimes, if you are in a newsroom that is national or local, you will probably cover election night in some way if you haven't already. It is a really prime time to look at different AI applications. At the Post, this was what we used AI most for because it was our bread and butter, right? Like working with all this incoming data. It's not something anyone should look at manually. I don't know how they did it before, like several decades ago without having to automatically scan through and flag things that are interesting for the editor because you have to pay attention to so many more things that need your attention than just the numbers coming in. So kind of figuring out how to work with AI to set up alerts that are interesting to you and train it to be like, hey, this is what I'm looking for. Working in spreadsheets, being comfortable in that, all very, very helpful in being able to understand like what is a job for a machine and what's a job for my human reporter or for me, for instance. Um, yeah, and then I think I have one more case study for you and a couple of resources. Not far from you, also in Evanston, just above Chicago, is a cohort or a program called Generative AI Newsroom. This is based in Northwestern, in the Medill School. It's also run by my former boss at the Washington Post, Jeremy Gilbert, and Nick Diakopoulos, who is another professor who oversees much of this implementation in AI and use cases. And this is just a good site for a million different use cases of how people are trying to use generative AI. And I thought this was a good perspective, which is generally like, what jobs can we give AI? What shortcuts might we be able to take that don't affect anything that's important, right? Like our integrity, our ethics, news gathering. Some things just should not be touched or automated at all. But being able to get into, hey, what's a tool that does one thing super well? What are processes that we can sort of examine and make a little bit faster so people can work on more interesting things that need their critical eye. And for instance, like what large language models are able to help us with, and what small language models are able to help us with for specific archives, like maybe our own body of work. Can we train a small language model, for instance, to be able to extract things for us that we should continue to follow up on and report? I'm going to point you to two resources and open up to questions. If any of this was interesting to you, it is okay if it is not. It's not everyone's bag, right? Um, the News Product Alliance is a little shout. I am on the board of this, so I'm going to disclose that. But that's because I really do believe in this work. I think that when you think about product in journalism, it's basically how do you turn something editorial into a successful, sustained thing that people come to expect. It could be a newsletter, could be a podcast, could be your website. How do you make that more successful, more useful to the people that you're trying to reach? That should be part of everyone's job, but it's not necessarily. There are often student scholarships for conferences. It just sold out for this particular one, but the Slack is a really, really good place to join. And you can go ahead and let's see, you can go ahead and join the Slack and you can see job opportunities, internship opportunities, people trying to find interns, lots of different things. Very, very worth joining this free community that is linked with people all around the country and internationally as well. The other ones I'll shout out for you is Online News Association. I was also on the board of this, but I also really do believe in them. One of the programs, several of the programs that they have is advancing online journalism and being able to talk about several different topics that are that are evolving as we speak. They have several communities that are local. They have a large conference that happens every year, lots of student scholarships as well. They have a student newsroom there where you get to network with a lot of people in every kind of news organization that you can possibly think of. Um, I think while you're a student trying to take advantage of this and seeing what your school offers in support for this to connect you to people like this will help you very, very much in your future career. And that's all I got for you. I'm happy to answer any questions and stay connected.